Yeah, so my name is Adam Birchweaver, and I am originally from Calgary, Alberta, and the big city, and furthest away possibly from growing food you could imagine. And then I went to the West Coast for university, and my mind just was opened up to the possibilities and the whole idea of these community-based food systems, and then spent many of my 20 many years in my 20s just traveling as a nomad, working for various NGOs, and really not settling down for anywhere for too long until my wife and I decided to move to the East Coast quite randomly and settle here and find a homestead that we could start developing our own permaculture farm on. So now we live out near Mactaquac area. We live beyond Mactaquac. Actually, it's called Scotch Lake, and we have 4 acres, and we've got a pretty big vegetable garden, 16th of it, or 1/16 of an acre, I guess. And we also have an orchard, and we're starting to develop a food forest there. And then we have all these different kinds of little projects going on as well. And then on top of that, I also work in the community development space. I worked at the Ville Community Center for a long time, and now I'm working with an organization called the Gaia Project, where I get to talk to students from K to 12 about sustainability and climate change, things we can do about climate change at the school level, at the community level, things like planting food forests in high school campuses, something we did like the other week. So I get to sort of talk about permaculture indirectly with students, and that gives them a little bit of an idea of how to sort of take care of our planet a little bit better. So I'm thrilled and honored to be able to do that as a job, and yeah, so that's the Coles Notes versions. I'll pass it over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Adam. So I'd have to really think back a bit sometimes about how I came to get inspired by permaculture. I grew up in a rural community, like near Sussex, and I spent a lot of time outside when I was young. But it was in 2010 I moved to Whitehorse to work for a little bit, and that was the first time in my life that I'd experienced a real housing insecurity. I think they were at almost a 0% vacancy rate, and I would just kind of schlep from like rented room to rented room with all my stuff, and sometimes I was only staying somewhere for like 3 weeks or 6 weeks. And I realized that like people need stability and housing to be happy in their life. And I started learning about, I guess it was straw bale that was like the first big interest for me. And then so I always had this interest in housing and design. And then I'd heard about permaculture a lot, but I never could grasp, because nobody could ever explain it to me well. All they could explain were like techniques. So for a while, I thought permaculture was when you put like a bunch of crushed seashells around the edge of your garden to keep slugs off. And I was like, okay, that seems a little incomplete. Anyway, so I heard about it enough times over the years, from about like 2010 on, that in 2016 I really got into it, and was doing a couple hours every morning of research and talking to people, and I started doing actual practice. And then 2 years later, I started Permaculture Atlantic Network, because I felt a bit isolated, and I felt like it was really hard to connect to people that had common interests, because I knew that they were there based on my experience living in a rural community, but I also knew that most people were well outside of the town, and there wasn't like this kind of central meeting area. So in May of 2018, I launched the website for the Permaculture Atlantic Network to get people connected through New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI, and then also like a little bit of, you know, riffing with like Vermont and Maine and Quebec, even like Labrador and Newfoundland as well. Yeah, and I work for the Raven Project, which stands for Rural Action and Voices for the Environment, and I'm working on food security strategies for the Upper Nashwauk Valley, which is like from north of Marysville, like Peniac, Teignmouth, all those areas up on the watershed. Okay, so I'll start the presentation here. So I just wanted to do a land acknowledgement. In this case, we're all on traditional Wabanaki territory today. I really want to emphasize the role of Indigenous teaching in permaculture. It's something that's often either completely passed or skimmed over. And I still have loads and loads of things to learn myself. But to not consider the eons of observation and testing and practice and building on techniques that have been contributed would be certainly a miss. So I'm very thankful for that knowledge, and I'm thankful for the land on which I get to practice it, which is also on Wolastoqey territory in the Nashwauk Valley. So already gave a little bit about the Permaculture Atlantic Network. In addition to kind of like doing the networking piece, I do try to promote education. So anytime somebody has a workshop going on, they'll send me information and I'll put it out in a newsletter. We do sometimes Zoom calls. So during the winter, we did a couple in partnership with Hayes Farm and the Raven Project, and we looked at composting and water management. And probably there'll be some more going on next year through the winter. And then we have perma chats or perma blitzes. So we've had a Fredericton chapter going since 2019. And if anybody wants to get added to that mailing list, you can just reach out to this permacultureatlantic@gmail.com and let me know. And we'll be hopefully getting a new group going this Sunday in Hampton. And there's always the option to have any new groups all over the province. And we do like get together and a potluck. We do a garden tour, little work party. It's been a pretty great experience, I think. Adam's been involved since the beginning in 2019.
Yeah, it's a great way to meet like-minded people and also just learn stuff. I learn best by doing, and that the Perma Blitz is all kind of centered around working on a project at someone's property and actually physically doing something before you have that potluck. So you got to work for your food at the Perma Blitz, but it's a great experience for sure.
So we have like in the roughly 2 hours, we want to give you a pretty light overview of permaculture with the idea that Mark or Claire can share this presentation with you. You can keep it for reference. And if you have any questions, at the very last slide, I have both my email and Adam's. So feel free to reach out. We definitely won't be able to get into any level of depth, but I just wanted to open it up by just if anybody already has experience with permaculture or they have their own very personal definition that they want to share, that might be a good way to get started.
Just go for it. Unmute yourself. Tell us what you think permaculture is.
Or projects you've worked on in the past that you think would be permaculture related.
All right, so we are dealing with a completely, like, nobody has any idea what permaculture is. That's great. That's exactly what our introduction to permaculture is all about. So that's good.
So Adam, do you want to start this one, or do you want me to do this?
Um, yeah, I guess I could tap into this a little bit. So, I mean, permaculture means a lot to a whole bunch of different people, and it's such a broad concept that it's really hard to capture. And it means different things to different people, but um, the origin, it came from permanent culture or permanent agriculture initially, and then it kind of transitioned to moving away from just agriculture to culture. And it's just a way of looking at the world, looking at certain problems, looking at certain situations, and trying to find a way that you can adapt it to be more in line with working in harmony with nature, and to sort of design things like your backyard, for example, to be more of a system that provides um, more to meet our human needs, but also to meet the needs of the whole ecosystem around it. And we generally tend to use systems-based thinking to sort of design these kinds of uh, these systems. But yeah, it's a tool, it's a philosophy, it's a way of thinking, it's a lens. I kind of think of it as a set of goggles that you can put on and to approach certain situations. And a lot of people think it has something to do with landscaping, and it does, but it also has a lot to do with community development. It has a lot to do with there's a whole other realm of it called social permaculture, um, which gets into how the workplace is formed. It gets into a whole bunch of different things other than just permaculture, but also taking a lot of these indigenous stewardship principles, such as like the honorable harvest, 7 generations thinking, dish with one spoon. All of these kinds of things are interrelated and interconnected into this sort of way of thinking. Amy, you want to add to that?
Yep. So permaculture would fit much more into, like, you're doing the regenerative farming certificate right now. I really have become pretty tired of the word sustainability. It just, when you look at monoculture tree plantations in New Brunswick, that's technically sustainable because you cut a tree, you plant a tree, you cut a tree again in 30 or 40 years. But permaculture is about helping us meet our needs immediately, but it's also about looking back over the last, let's say, 400 or 500 years, and so much damage has been done to ecosystems and technologies like the plow, for instance, and fossil fuels and non-organic fertilizers and all that kind of thing, and saying, well, we actually have the tools to fix this. So we're not just it goes beyond our personal responsibility for our own lifestyle into saying, well, nature will heal these things on her own, but we can also speed that process along by helping with reforestation and habitat development. And the history, I will not go into much in depth. You can find some decent articles online. I think Toby Hemingway and a couple others have got into this, but in the 1960s, there was a fellow named Bill Mollison, and he had been just doing all kinds of random jobs. I think he might have been a high school dropout. He worked in labor and forestry and parks in Tasmania, and he became really disillusioned with how he saw things being managed in the forest and marine ecosystems. And he kind of dropped out of society for about 3 years. And then he had this realization during the end of that time that that wasn't actually helping anybody, including himself. So he started work at the University of Tasmania eventually, and he found this student, David Holmgren, and what they started to do is coalesce all these indigenous principles from all over the world. So they might have been you know, it might have been Aborigines in Australia, but it could have been how do Inuit catch fish and hunt. It could have been anything, right? So they looked at the commonalities and then started to form them into some ethics and principles. And the first permaculture design certificate, if you hear us say PDC, that's what it means. The first one happened in India in about 1990, and they happen every year all over the world now.
And I should also mention that yeah, if you haven't done a PDC or if you haven't heard of a PDC before, it's a great way. It's beyond introduction to permaculture. It's kind of getting those lens on your head is the best way to think of it. And I did my PDC back in 2014 with this organization called Permaculture, which coincidentally was based out of Calgary, so it worked out quite well for me. And they've kind of sort of stood out now as leaders in promoting permaculture, and they do a really good job. I would highly recommend looking into their resources. They've got a lot of great stuff.
And if anybody wants to do training and you have questions, feel free to email both of us. There's a lot of things to consider when you pick a training, and a lot of that is based on your personality and what you want to get out of it. So that, and it's 72 hours, and it's usually a couple $1,000s. So it's a good thing to do some in-depth research into before you make that choice. And so I just briefly touched in the last slide about permaculture meeting human needs. So I just wanted to think a little bit more deeply into that. Food is an obvious one. We talk a lot about food security and shelter and good quality home design that makes people feel good and is energy efficient. Air purification, it doesn't seem like such a big deal here, but obviously mainland China, lots of places in the world, Italy, it's a huge issue. Water management and purification. You'll see very quickly that water comes to be one of the most important aspects of permaculture design. What do we use for fuel? What do we use for fibers? So maybe fiber seems insignificant to us now because we buy our clothing from stores, but the Industrial Revolution and starting to make clothing in factories actually just completely transformed global history. So, and also agriculture, interestingly enough. And then we need social connection. So that becomes the social permaculture element. Adam, I'll do this one, and then do you want to start into the principles of it?
Sure.
So we have these three, this little triangle here. So the green one is earth care, the red one is people care, and the blue one is fair share. So I think earth care and people care can be fairly obvious. The fair share piece really gets into that 7th generation principle and thinking beyond ourselves in the present day and thinking beyond ourselves in the future. So for me, well, fair share can have a lot. It can be very simple. So it's basically start where you're able to. And in North America, we're probably all taking more than we need because we live in a capitalist society. It's very difficult not to. We try not to waste. We do the best that we can. But so we have to walk that fine line between putting enough energy and effort in to feel like we're doing our part, but not to feel, guilty or distraught or whatever about this. We want to always keep a productive, thoughtful lens and kind of keep moving forward and doing good work. So there's the immediate fair share, which may just be simple activities like buying fair trade coffee and cycling and composting. And then if people have the resources available and the inclination, and they can start to move into those higher and higher levels. But I found I live off grid and I grow a fair amount of food, and I've altered my lifestyle a lot. I don't fly anymore, but I found each one of those things to be really challenging. They take quite a bit of time to implement, and I have to recognize that they're not available to everybody. You know, I've used the bits of privilege that I have in my life to be able to do those things, but they're not available for a lot of the people on the planet. So I guess that's how I would sort of preface the fair share piece.
I like to muse that if there was a political party that was centered around these three ethics, then it would be the best political party ever, I think. You know, it's probably not too far off from what the Green Party has, to be honest. But that fair share piece is what I think a lot of politicians don't even want to tap into, because I think every political party is ingrained into that sort of capitalistic mindset in a way. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's that sweet spot, that intersection between taking care of the planet, taking care of each other, and making sure that everyone gets a fair piece of the pie. And that just seems like all of those elements are so topical when you think about all of the things that we're talking about now, in the news with, reconciliation, and we've got, Black Lives Matter and all these other movements that are going on. The sweet spot is right in the middle of this, really. And like, social damage is an environmental damage. And there's a great documentary that came out recently. It's called Something in the Water. I think that's what it's called, where it looks into environmental racism, and that's totally a thing. It's crazy. So they're all inextricably linked.
Well put.
And
so there are 12 principles. Yeah, you go ahead, Adam. We have one example that we can show you after.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, like, without getting too much into the detail, into the weeds, so to speak, of all of these different principles, these are the kinds of elements that help us to make informed decisions, or permaculture-based decisions. And it's not necessarily like you have to do them in order, but they generally tend to work in some kind of order. And so observe and interact seems to be, to me, like the most important and foundational principle that you could think of in permaculture. And if you kind of think about it, if you were inherited a blank piece of land, and you had this sort of idea in your mind to put a homestead on it, or something, you couldn't just plop a house down there. Well, you could, but you might end up regretting some things later on, once you figure it out, maybe where it floods in certain areas, or maybe where there's this really heavy prevailing wind or something. So it's really important to observe any kind of situation. And like, again, I always kind of go towards this sort of landscaping, homesteady kind of mentality about it, because that's where a lot of permaculture is focused. But you can also tag this onto your own work environment and your own home environment, your like relationships with other people and your family. And so again, it always comes down to like just observing the situation and really kind of taking it in. And some people, and myself included, like when we moved in, I didn't do anything on the property really for the first year. We just kind of observed what was growing there, what was where the wind was coming from, how much snow accumulated in the winter in certain spots, and so on. And of course, if we just observed without interacting, we wouldn't actually achieve very much. We might get a lot of data, but it's really that experimentation and sort of playing around with things, and seeing how different things work. And really, that's permaculture is all about, trying to come up with, well, not necessarily coming up with new ideas, but modifying ideas to meet your specific needs in that specific situation. And then, yeah, I mean, I could get into all of these. I could talk about each one of these for hours, but really and then catching and storing energy is an important aspect of of permaculture. So we're not just talking about renewable energy like solar or wind, although that is part of it. It's also like storing water. Water is energy in a sense. And, you know, collecting water, rainwater off of a roof, for example, is a method of catching and storing energy. Obtaining a yield is important. You know, we all got to feed ourselves, for example. So it's great to, you know, get something out of the system that you have, and it's great if you can have a system that provides a yield without you having to simply just extract. It's about that sort of reciprocity, and it's you giving back. So I kind of think of when you're harvesting things out of your garden, I like to top dress it with compost. You know, you're giving back to it, and you're obtaining a yield. Applying self-regulation, this is kind of like, this always makes me think of like climate change. We recognize now that the planet is warming, and scientists have been raising the alarms for years. And finally, I feel like there's like a little bit of momentum, especially down in the States with the new president and all. I feel like there's a little bit more seriousness in climate change, and so we see this trend, hopefully, of us lowering our CO2 emissions and kind of we recognize there is an issue and we're applying self-regulation. If we don't, then the planet will heat up too much and it'll go beyond a point of no return. So it's important to, yeah, observe these kinds of things and then make little changes to apply that self-regulation. And then using and valuing renewable resources, you know, that one's pretty self-explanatory. Producing no waste is another element. You know, in any system, and this kind of touches on the circular economy or closed loop systems, where there really in nature there really is no waste. If you think about it, there is no waste. Every little bit of nature is used. You know, leaves fall from a tree, they compost on the top layer of the ground surface, and they provide all these other benefits for the, you know, microorganisms below. So there really is no waste, and we shouldn't have any waste in our society as well. So when we have these corporations dumping a bunch of toxic waste into the environment and killing entire ecosystems, that's devastating, and we shouldn't be allowed to do that. That should be 100% illegal. We should find uses for that waste, and there probably are uses we just haven't thought of yet. Design. Sorry, go ahead.
This graphic in particular comes from the Permaculture Institute, which is like an international. And if you like, whenever you see this graphic, it's been borrowed, obviously, but it's often tied back to them. And if you go to their website, you can find a pretty in-depth explanation on each one of these. So it would be a handy thing to just read through or print out or whatever. And one of the challenges with market gardening, I'm glad that the Hayes Farm takes the regenerative approach, because market gardening can tend to get very, very precise, and you get into yields because, you know, obviously people have an income that's tied to that too. But it's important for the long term to do things that are not always the most cost effective. So like using the edges and valuing the marginal. So at the Hayes Farm, I can't recall which numbers the field blocks are, but down on the line with the neighboring property where there's that big willow tree, that was always very wet from the beginning. And it was really nice that the decision was made to just leave that a wet fallow area down there and to let that willow do its stuff. And those are the important things in saying, you know, I can have ecosystems on my farm, no matter how small my farm is, even if it's only garden size. I'm always going to make a little space for my hummingbirds and barn swallows and whatever else happens to like want it naturally there.
Yeah, and I'll quickly go through a couple more of these. The design from patterns to details is kind of touching on like the importance of learning from nature and this whole idea of biomimicry, which is, designing things to sort of mimic nature, because nature has evolved over millions and millions of years to be as efficient and as resilient as possible. So if we can incorporate these patterns that we find in nature, and in this picture here, there's an example of like a spider web. A spider web is like a super strong and resilient thing that doesn't really, it's like anti-fragile, right? So we have to design anti-fragile systems. And integrate rather than segregate, again, goes without saying, but like when you have a whole range of diversity of ideas or different different people from different backgrounds come together and sit around a circle together, I think that's when you can really get really, really great solutions and ideas, when you get a whole diversity of ideas. And it's not just that, but it's integrating and trying to get as much out of one thing as possible. So yeah, so I'll keep on going here. Use small and slow solutions. So it's not always about finding the fastest solution. Slow and steady wins the race. That's the adage there. Use and value diversity. It's kind of like integrate rather than segregate, but when I think of that one, it's like, you could plant one crop of something and then it could get wiped out by something like a disease or a pest. But if you interplanted a whole bunch of stuff together, like you do at the Hayes Teaching Farm, they're going to be more resilient. So yeah, that's quite important. And then use edges and value the marginal. So oftentimes in nature, and as a person who loves to collect wild edibles from the forest, the best place to find things often is along the edges. That's where you find the most diversity of things, I find. And so this principle kind of touches on not just the edges of like forests or anything, but like also the edges of society. And the edges of anything that you could really think of. That's where the sweet stuff is. So if you can integrate that into your system somehow, that is great. And creatively use and respond to change. Yeah, I mean, again, this kind of gets into the climate change idea. So we're facing this like huge crisis, but out of it all, we could potentially come out of it, especially with COVID and everything. We could come out of COVID and come up with these creative solutions to also tackle the climate crisis, and hopefully, like the Green New Deal is a great example of all of that. Like it kind of touches on these problems that we're facing now, and then responding to them and creatively coming up with these ideas to sort of change our society for the better, and come out of it for the better. So yeah, Amy, do you have anything else to sort of add to these principles?
Just maybe to like emphasize the social level and how broad permaculture is. So if you talk about valuing the marginal in terms of the pandemic, who's suffered most? Well, it's often been people that have precarious work situations, people that are working low income service jobs. But guess what? Those people that are in the marginalized workforce positions have been the people that have been putting themselves at risk to move us through this whole time, and basically, keep the ship on course and make sure that we have groceries available to us and that we can go buy our garden supplies. And I am thankful in that the pandemic has highlighted that, and we're starting to think a little bit more about workers' rights and folks that we have tended to just like keep in our peripheral vision all the time. And that can be a more subtle way about how we can apply permaculture to society.
Well said. Yeah.
So maybe this is a good time to see if anybody has any questions or wants to talk about anything. I've got kind of a limited view here. I'm sort of clicking through to see what's going on, but feel free to just unmute yourself and speak whenever you want.
Is anyone's mind just been blown? Is anyone out there? Well, I gotta say, when I found all this stuff out, I was just like,
Yeah, I did spend every morning before work for many months just going through book after book. And I think I started with one of the key texts was the Whole Systems Research Farm, which is based in Vermont. I really like getting into stuff that is relevant to climate, similar to our own. I'm not very focused on what happens in, say, like the tropics or arid dryland permaculture. Even though you learn all of that how those things work in principle, and that is quite important because permaculture is global, but I've tended to focus really in on the Atlantic environment, and that's been really rewarding.
I love how inclusive it is. It's very inclusive, which is cool. Like it comes full circle, which is what I really enjoy.
Yeah,
definitely.
It's good to get into that habit of just like thinking about who's left out, like, okay, who's here? That's great. We acknowledge everybody that showed up, but like who's missing from a social setting or who's not considered in an ecosystem. And then you can get into like really a little more abstract thinking, like, is it okay to take a rock from a national park, right? Does that rock belong there? Is that where it lives? That's where it was formed. And we can get really into like it can go far into also personal spirituality. If there's something that you're interested in that dovetails well into permaculture, then that works really nicely too.
I really like it too, how it integrates like the environment and people and social justice, because I find in activism there's a tendency to, or not just activism, but like a tendency to be like, it's very polarizing. So I've like spoken to activists who are like, I don't have time to think about climate change because I have to like get food on the table and I have to deal with like, racist violence. So like that seems really like bourgeois to care about climate change when we have all these crises right now. Or climate activists who are like not considering the social justice piece. And so I really like it how it's like you can't think about these things, I hate the expression, but like in silos. It has to be like all interconnected. And so yeah, I've just kind of actually, since I attended your guys' talk in the pandemic, been like doing a bit of reading, and I just like what Emilio says, like I like it how it's applicable and like interconnected. Yeah, it's exciting.
Well, right now, okay, in New Brunswick, we have this neurological disease that's happening to people that's not understood, and it's getting, national attention. And there's a pretty good chance that there's an environmental cause. And then you have other situations like, I remember reading about deforestation in West Africa as being a direct correlation to having increased levels of malaria, because you cut down trees and then topsoil erodes because you have bare land. And then you've got this sort of like a hard pan that forms. And
I wonder how much
go ahead.
Irving is, I'm sorry, I wonder how much Irving is involved with that whole brain thing. Like I feel like they've gone silent ever since because apparently it's a leak. Nobody was supposed to know about that brain thing, but a doctor leaked it. And like, I'm wondering how much Irving has to do with that environmental thing.
Well, it would be hard to know right now. But if you took the cumulative environmental impact, it would be pretty massive. In terms of, so so that you have the flooding example that creates stagnant water pools that creates malaria. But in New Brunswick, when you have deforestation on the watershed, so the steeper parts of the watershed, you have all this water that runs down and causes flooding. And then what happens is that water, it picks up like diesel tanks. It runs through sheds and barns that have fertilizer stored in them. It hits sewage treatment plants and manure, like, what do they call them? The sludge pools, where they store it in water before they do spraying. So all of those things have a massive impact on human health, from E. coli and all contaminants to long-term contamination of drinking water. So you could say, you know, like there's some distance between cutting the trees and this contamination, but ultimately they're connected.
And I mean, like there's a link between, you know, the damaged environment and the COVID crisis, right? Like it's kind of people resorting to having to eat certain kind. I mean, this is all a theory, I guess, but like the people resorting to eating different kinds of bush meat, as they call it, and like that could be ultimately what caused brought the virus into humans, right? So I mean, they're all in, like I said, inextricably, I can't even say it very well, inextricably linked, 100%. And the mass migrations are all linked to climate change too. I mean, it just goes on and on.
So we had other examples in different years. Like we had talked about chinampas, which are these sort of things in Mexico and in that area where they would dig up from the swampy or the lake lands and form garden beds. But we decided this time we're going to talk a little bit more about more local examples. So fishing weirs can be seen anywhere up and down the Bay of Fundy, all through New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And I found some interesting stuff on this. So they're common to just about every, this says marine culture, but also for freshwater. They get used in lakes, tidal zones, estuaries, rivers, and they actually can quite likely predate modern humans. So we're talking like hundreds of thousands of years that this technology has been used. This is oh well, I won't get too much ahead of myself, but they're usually made of rocks, particularly when they're in fresh water, like a sort of a ford across a river. A lot of the saltwater ones here are these posts, wooden posts that are probably 7 to 12 feet high, depending on how far they are in the tidal zone. And the fish get inside, so they go in through this this open channel, and often fish, at least in a saltwater marine environment, they'll swim together, and then once they get inside, if they're in a school, they just keep circling. And I've heard other people saying in the freshwater setting that once the fish gets into this big open space, it feels kind of comfortable, and it pushes itself out to the edges, and it kind of can like hide and huddle in there. And the fish don't seem to want to go and push back through that small opening. It feels sort of threatening. So it's a principle that could have really, I think, only been found through observation and testing. And the tides also help too. So a lot of fish get brought in at high tide, and then they remain in the weir at low tide, which means that if you're somebody that's interested in using all of your bycatch as well, if you're willing to harvest everything, that can be, there doesn't have to be any waste. A lot of people are, taking these bait fish, but you could have eels and lots of different things that are things that we can eat. And biologists have been using this as a way to do biological sampling. So there are a couple of First Nations in Alaska that have been working on these projects, and they just go into the weirs and they get, some of them get these kind of radio tags put on them. Some of them swim in front of, it's neat. They have these like glass walls, and then behind them they have kind of a grid. And as the fish swims in front of the grid, somebody like snaps a picture of it. So they can check every single salmon that goes through the weir enclosure, and they can get a length and a photo on each one. So the biological applications to this really ancient technology are quite interesting. Has anybody ever used a weir, seen a weir set up? Just for curiosity, I don't know if people are from the coast. It's not something I'm terribly familiar with, but I know they're quite common here. So why don't we just maybe not spend too much time on this, but why don't we go back to the principles, thinking about a fishing weir, and see if we can come up with like a couple of examples of how the principles are put into action with that technology.
You could say it's like a small solution instead of like having a whole fleet like trawling. It's like a small kind of local solution.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Are there any patterns involved? Natural patterns? Spirals, perhaps?
Yeah, well, and it looks like that. I don't remember who showed us. Maybe it was Cecilia, but that kind of traditional, like indigenous symbol, like I can't draw it, but even the shape of it looks like something I've seen in art from like indigenous folks in this community. And I think someone said it was like a smoke ring or something.
Does it look a bit like a heart that's drawn out really far? Or something
Yeah.
like that? Yeah. That's pretty neat. And I think a lot of, prior to colonization, a lot of language and symbology was based on that, right? So even like lessons and parables, you have the really popular one all over the world is like the snake eating its own tail, and different, lizards crossed over each other and different things like that. So that was part of written language for a long, long time. I was thinking about producing no waste. I went to the dump the other day, which is such a surreal experience. I kind of like to go there and look at the birds, even though it's a little bit sad. And there was one whole bank just full of fishing nets. And having worked for the Conservation Council for a little while, I know that they call it ghost gear. There's so much of it around, and whales become entangled in it, and it lasts for a long time because if you went back to maybe even like pre-1950s, people used a lot of hemp, but it's super hard on the hands, and it splinters a little bit and unravels. So then they started to use nylon ropes and cordage, which of course don't go anywhere. But you got rocks and you got sticks. So at the end of the day, there's no harm if you don't even remove it. Like a lot of weirs were removed when the shipping industry started. So in Europe, they would get upset because it was hard to bring big boats in when there were weirs in the way. But there are some in around the UK that are probably, the rock ones are around 800 years old now. You can still see the remnants. It just looks like a big wall down the beach. So I thought that was pretty good.
Quite a contrast to what's going on today. Has anyone seen Seaspiracy? Because, oh my God, lots of plastic in the ocean, folks. It's really sad.
I watched that. It's a great one. I like that one.
Yeah, it's alarming.
Find I have to pace myself with movies like that from the sounds of it.
Yeah, That
Don't
one's
watch them before bed. So I think, yeah, observe and interact. Obviously, people learned how the fish behave by spending time on cliff edges and wading in the water and trying to understand where they move and what they do. Then you have the edges. So you've got shorelines, you've got estuaries, which are the most rich ecotone on the planet for biodiversity. You got, as we mentioned, the small and slow solutions, no waste, and then designing from patterns to details.
what about obtaining a yield?
Oh yeah.
And I'm not just talking about fish. I'm also talking about fish poop and all that other fun stuff that floats probably down to the bottom. I'm not saying you'd go down and collect it, but it is probably going down and providing nutrients for other little creatures down there.
Mm-hmm. I learned the best fact. It's not exactly related, but I'm going to tell you because it's funny and it might make you happy. So whales eat, krill and all kinds of different small aquatic invertebrates. And then when they have to go to the bathroom, they find it like very hard to do that at the deep underwater depths because there's so much pressure on them. So basically they swim to the surface and have like a big giant poop and then swim back down again. But when all of that, I don't know what you call it, if you call it manure when it's from fish, and the fish waste then is like in that top warm surface layer of water, and it starts feeding the algae and it starts feeding more of the little micro invertebrate creatures, and it becomes this massive nutrient cycling food source. So just like whales just keep on pooping. They're just doing us such a favor. So stacking functions is a really important thing in permaculture. We don't have enough time to really get into much for design today, but I wanted to look at this, and I wanted to look at the 80-20 Pareto principle just a bit. So this is like an idea that has come up. Google uses this sort of technology. It could be used anywhere in New Brunswick in a pretty simple way. So you've got these solar panels that are acting as parking garages. But then I thought, well, what else can we do with this, right? So we can add gutters and we can redirect all of that rain into food forests. Like, it's really problematic when rain hits pavement, especially in a parking lot, because every vehicle that's been parked there that has had like windshield washer fluid or gasoline or diesel or whatever leak out of it, which is pretty common, that gets picked up in the storm runoff, which ends up ultimately in streams and rivers and whatnot. So using the upper canopy as a channel keeps that rainwater clean so that it can be sunk down into the ground and not contaminated. And then it could reduce urban heat sinks. It's sort of bouncing some of that heat back up before it gets to soak into the pavement. It would keep your car clean in the wintertime, which would be amazing. I would say in New Brunswick, I would not recommend this this like arch shape. I would have a real hard angle and I would back it up so that the snow would slide off of them and then like collect down here. But that's a pretty minor adaptation. If you wanted to, you could put lighting on the underside of the panel powered by the panels above, and you could have like Harvest Jazz and Blues Festival. Like, I was kind of thinking in my head about the York Street parking lot in Fredericton that runs most of the way along the river there. And then it could also be a space for an emergency shelter. So if you had flooding or some kind of natural disaster and you needed to keep people outside but in a contained area, that would be a really cool place to do it. Does anybody else have any other ideas? Like, there's probably another dozen that I didn't think of that could be applied.
I feel like even Hayes Farm has like stacking functions.
Oh
because
yeah.
like there's so much collaboration, like with Lisa Pearly Dutcher using the space, and like so many different, like even us students come from so many different streams and all kind of have like different functions, and it's like producing food for like not for profits, and then for people just buying for their own consumption, and we're doing composting. So I feel like it's kind of broad, but I think so.
Yeah, and Sinead's doing like her farming there too. So there's like a lot of different, and then there was talks of doing like a holistic immersion program in that new building. Like there's all kinds of functions that are being stacked, and even recently we put up that the living wall right outside the bathroom, and the function there was to just provide a bit more privacy, and hopefully we can stack even further by having the water from the hand washing station go into the living wall, but maybe that's a project for later.
Awesome.
Stack those functions. And there was an article that recently that Raven just released, I think today, where they're talking about solar arrays and mixing that onto agricultural fields and gardens. So I think that's another potential stack,
Mhm.
promising stack.
Sinead's garden is looking awesome.
Nice.
Yeah, she's got a great situation going. She's growing leafy greens, and she's doing a CSA model, which I think is brilliant. And she's sold out of her shares, which is wicked.
So that a lot of what's happening at the Hayes Farm is social permaculture, and as Adam mentioned at the beginning, it's a lot of systems-based thinking and thinking about how do individuals fit together, how do groups of individuals fit together, how when you have a community, how do separate communities interact with each other. Even in Fredericton, it's a bit strange because you have the south side and the north side, you know, and the north side is a collection of neighborhoods because people were amalgamated in the 90s. So, you know, it's Devon and Barker's Point and Marysville, and they were all their own community at one time, right? So a lot of the time people are trying to like cooperate and fit into a larger structure, but still maintain their unique sense of identity and characteristics.
Did you
And-
guys know? Oh, sorry. Well, with that, since COVID started to happen, what I'm finding, even before,
Dorian, you're on mute, or whoever was speaking.
okay, when COVID decided to happen, I find even before that a lot of people were starting to make their own gardens and preparing. And then since COVID happened, I find there's more and more people doing that. And I find it's great. And there's more community gardens.
I'm on a few forums, which I don't check very often, but I happened to find this message the other day, and it was so long. There was like 60 comments or something. And usually it's only something really controversial, or maybe somebody's trying to solve a problem and they're looking for help. But anyway, in this case, this lady had said she lived in Woodstock and she built a garden. She said, you know, it's not too much. It's kind of scrappy. It's this raised bed with like recycled wood. But she said she had just had either lost her job or had her employment reduced, and she didn't have the means to fill it with soil. And I was so impressed. There was like, some people had given her like tips on how to do these lasagna beds and how to like fill it up with organic matter that she can find. But then other people were like straight up like, I'm gonna just bring a half-ton load full of compost or manure to your house. Or somebody else said, you know what, I'm gonna come and garden with you if you want to do that. And I just thought it was like really lovely to see people reaching out in a really positive way when there's like often so much controversy. And I think that the pandemic has softened us a little bit in that way. So
And
you're-
another thing I'm finding now with like everything's being GMO
Mhm.
and a lot of pesticides and a lot of hormone growth, like in our meats and too. I find like people are going more natural in the last 5 years or more, but it's been noticeable through.
And it does affect our children, you know, like all this GMO and all these hormone injections they give their. Can you hear me?
Yep. Oh, I think you're on mute again. Doreen, can you hear me? You're on mute. Hmm.
Well, just further to what Doreen was saying, like the No Mo May, like everyone was just tapping into No Mo May this year. And I noticed like I'd never seen so many dandelion seeds in the air. Like it seemed like it was snowing out near my place. Like I'd never seen that before. It was crazy. But it is
So what I'm
palpable. You can
basic-
feel that there's a movement going on right now.
So I'm basically saying everybody's being more aware of what they're putting into their bodies and what they're feeding their children.
Mhm.
Because with all this, and I find with there's a lot of things that are affecting like even our children, like their emotions, their growth, their maturity. I find since everything has all these hormones and everything is being GMO, I find it's affecting like everyone, especially our children, because nowadays children don't have enough of that home cooked meals. But you know what? COVID has been a blessing in disguise because now the kids are finally getting that nutrition in their system, and all the global what do you call it, media is affecting everyone. And it's like I'm basically saying we're like considering like what to put in our bodies, and I think that's good, you know. So that's all I have to say.
Thanks. That was
I
really
agree.
really good. And I'm sorry you did. We lost you for just like a second. We weren't meaning to talk over you, but yeah, really good points about how to take. I hate to say take advantage of it, like a tragic situation, but more to use it to the best of our abilities to have kind of like a paradigm shift, to think about a new way to live that's not just like fiddling around with the old bad way to live, really.
And again, it gets into the creatively responding to change and
Mhm.
adapting to change, like one of the principles.
The best book that I could recommend that would be like a real quick read through where you don't have to like get involved, you can just take little sections, is a book called Change Here Now, Permaculture, Solutions for Personal Community Transformation by Adam Brock. And that was available at the Fredericton Public Library, and you can probably still order it. It talks about a lot of different things, including the economy. Super interesting. And you may have actually added more to this since I made this slide last, but this is how Hayes Farm works in social permaculture. And I should say social permaculture has ended up becoming my area of expertise. So within the permaculture community, I see a lot of people that get really involved in specific things. Like Adam is a market gardener and a forager. I'm also into like renewables and housing to some level, but social permaculture is really the area that I've wanted to go further in.
Amy, I'd totally forgotten about that project. I'd kind of I put it out of my mind, but that was when we first opened up where field blocks 7, 8, 9, and now 10 and 11 are. We had a horse and harrow come in after us, but we did a good half of this field with people power. It was pretty awesome.
Yeah, or not awesome, but it's amazing how hard pulling it was okay, but then pulling it and turning it proved to be a bit of a challenge. But it's just the funniest picture that I have from any of them that I've ever taken on a farm.
And I just add a thought regarding I was thinking about the benefits and trying to take advantage of the pandemic. And my thought on it is that while it's good for us to do that, the fair share aspect is like totally missing because there are places where that isn't happening. And I just wanted to recognize that.
Well, there's like a hoarding of vaccine shots too. I mean, that's like Canada's like, no, they're all ours. We don't want to give any to India. Like, screw them. There is totally like inequalities for sure. Globally.
And this is a precarious time where people need to be more vocal, because we know that without getting too far into it, maybe some people have read The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, and a lot of corporations and government tend to take advantage of situations that are states of emergency or natural disasters. Like in 2003, after the tsunami, a lot of villages on the Indian Ocean that had just been fishing villages for hundreds, if not thousands of years, not rebuilt. The people were presumably resettled, and then you had a lot of high-end condos and resorts go back into those spaces. So it's like nice to have a hopeful outlook, but also very important to consider that there's a lot we can lose too if we don't stay cautious and stay on it. And so I see Adam's gone for a break there. So I'll just start talking a little bit about the global permaculture. And there's on the left here, you see these multi-story homes in the desert. This is, I think it's in Mali, but there's one in Ghana as well in the northern part where it's like quite dry. And it's a mosque made entirely out of these mud bricks. And it is the oldest African-made structure on the continent. So when I say that, I mean it's not like a castle or a slave fort built by Europeans. It's the longest standing traditional building. And the cool thing about this innovation is the bottom is actually used for animals. So the livestock are in there and they're safe. The second story, which you usually get to from a ladder, is where people would sleep and do tasks in the middle of the day when it's really hot. And then the roof level is where people do things like hang out laundry, but also where they sleep at night because it's cooler. So it's like perfectly adapted to the environment. And the mud brick could be like probably, I'm guessing, sort of 16 to maybe even as much as 20 inches. So it keeps the heat out during the hottest part of the day. And this is actually, it's how it's how the first human settlements were ever built. So there were no streets in the first cities. If you go back to Turkey, everybody had like houses that were connected together, and you had rooftop walkways, and then you had up-down ladders. And so there was no such thing, presumably, as privacy. Like, this is my roof, you can't be here. It was just like, well, I'm going to my auntie's house, and people lived in also family groups. So you can see that permaculture is such a part of our human evolution too. Adam, do you want to talk about the Meghalaya?
Yeah, I mean, Meghalaya is just a really cool example of permaculture. It's a thing that's going on in India. I mean, it's like it's happening in like the wettest part of the world. It's in part like a region in India where they receive the most rainfall like all at once, like several meters or something crazy. And so that means that the rivers just kind of wash out any bridges that they were making. And so they started over time, like who knows when, like how far back they started making these, but they started creating these like living bridges using a certain type of vine. And there's a picture of it here in the bottom left here. And what it's like something that it's like an intergenerational project where, you know, the elders would be teaching the youth how to maintain and continue to build these living bridges. And it's just a beautiful example of passing on this sort of knowledge to the next generation, to have these like resilient bridges so they can have more mobility. So I think that I would highly recommend YouTubing Meghalaya. There's a really great video on it. It's super cool.
So there's a couple of things that we would be more familiar with. Like, I actually really like the photo of this particular place in King's Landing. I think I went there when I was about 8 on a field trip, and I made butter in that barn. So it's always like a really cute thing for me. But you can see how you have the house built in 2 pieces. So most often settlers actually started with just one room, which was their sort of kitchen sleeping area, the smaller part. The second living area of the house got added on, usually after the first winter or the first year. Then you have this like little shed in between, which is hard to see, but it's a sheltered section, so you never have to go outside during sort of the worst pouring rain or sleet or whatever. And then the barn is so immediate to the house because it was so essential to how life worked. You never see very many of these settlers homes where you had to walk like a half a kilometer to get to a barn. And the only thing that was in the barn were the horses, right? So people set up their infrastructure based on how they live their life and vice versa. And we're really, really bad at that today. And then socially, like some global permaculture, like we have to think about community sizes. So when the Amish, I guess Mark's not, he's probably not on the call now, but he has a lot of experience working with Amish communities. And when they get to a certain size, I think it's at least 100 people. I don't think they go beyond a couple hundred most of the time. But when they can't feed themselves on the amount of land that they have, they start splitting off and moving out into new areas and looking for new land for more communities. Kind of like bees will swarm when there's too many for the hive. So that's a pretty neat thing. The people have learned how to adapt to their environment.
And I just want to say too, like there's examples of global permaculture like all over the place, even though maybe in those regions or those places they won't know it as permaculture. It's just how things are. But there's so much to learn from these traditional cultures. Like almost every culture that you really kind of look at under a microscope will have elements of this sort of continued permanent resilient structures that often work in harmony with nature.
I remember Alma Brooks one day was saying, well, permaculture is just native knowledge in disguise. And I don't know if she thought I was going to argue with her. And I was like, yep, you're totally right. You're totally on.
Well, I was interested where you said like the originators were working in that university and like doing a study of like all these indigenous and like traditional, like, do you know, was that like in consultation, like through dialogue with like, it's in some ways my like red flag goes up of like appropriation, or was it very like academic study? Like I'd be interested, I'll have to do my own reading, but like in how that process was done. Like I don't know if those first 2 guys were like settlers or if they were like indigenous folks themselves, or I'd just be interested in that history.
So even in universities at that time, their consultation was terrible. I mean, I know about what I know about culture from anthropological readings, and almost every anthropologists from the 1800s, even into the 1990s and on, where it was cultural appropriation, or it was like doing studies in communities, but not really sharing information back with the community, or not having the community's best interest in mind. And I would say it's pretty likely that there wasn't that kind of consultation, Julia. I think they probably talked to people, they used common knowledge, they went through books, and maybe did at best like some field work with Aborigines in Australia. But it would be sort of more like open source technology in a sense, I guess, would be the only way to really think about it.
Yeah, and it's easy to get kind of bogged down into, oh, like Bill and Dave home, like it's like I often get people get held up on who started it, when and why, but it's also kind of like it's important to go beyond, like look beyond who just started it, because it's them collecting all of this information. And yeah, maybe it is appropriation, or maybe it's appreciation, but yeah, you're probably right. In the 80s, they probably weren't doing proper consultations. But I think the essence of what they're trying to get across is quite important.
So there is a bit of, without getting heavy into the design, because we've just got a half an hour left, there is a process to permaculture. And that process always, always, always starts with observation. And the more time you can observe, the better. And the more time you can interact, the better. And then, so imagine you're getting your land for the very first time, and maybe you're not even buying it yet. Maybe you just have the opportunity to camp on it and walk through it and whatever. So you would spend every season tenting and checking it out. And then you can start to map it out, because I'll tell you, having done a little bit of design work, most of our sense of spatiation is very poor. Like even land that I own, or land that I steward, I guess, I go there and I look at it, and what I see is very, very different from the memory that I had of that land in my head. So now I've got one of those little roller wheels. Like it has a handle, and you push it along, and you can measure how many meters everything is. And so I do that so that I don't have to worry about like second guessing myself when I start to do my planning. Adam, do you want to talk about zones and sectors?
Sure. Yeah.
We do actually. Sorry, we have one photo of the zone here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is a big element of permaculture, and it's quite important to sort of start thinking that in this way. And it kind of comes down to efficiency, but it also comes down to practicality as well. So let's kind of pretend that you've been granted, you have been given this piece of land, and you now want to start designing your dream property. You have to sort of think about the proximity of certain things to your house. And so, there's zone 0, which would be your house, or zone 00, which would be yourself, your sort of your own being. And then going out from there, you want to have like your kitchen garden as close as possible to your house, so that when you're cooking up your meal, you don't have to go all the way to the other end of your property to collect your chives. They're right there, so you can pop in and out of your house to go get them. And then to contrast that, it's like you got your zone 5 going as far out. You've got your kind of wilderness zone, where you might have a certain space for meditation, or you might go out there to collect certain types of mushrooms. And really, this is a design tool, and it's a great way to sort of think about where you can place things. Maybe you don't have the options of where you're going to be placing things. Like for us, our chicken coop, we were lucky to have a chicken coop on our property when we moved in, but it was like situated kind of a little bit further than I would have liked. And had I had been able to redo it, I would have it a lot closer to the house. So we didn't have to make that journey in the winter back and forth. So it can be an efficiency thing, but it's also just a matter of easily being able to do things. Because also when you have easy access to something, I think like I'm partially an artist and I do a lot of wood carving and stuff. And when my tools are sort of packaged up and put away, I don't make as much stuff as I would as if it was just easily accessible. So that's kind of the mentality that we're trying to get across here with this zone thinking. And yeah, I mean, you can think about this in terms of like your friends and your acquaintances and your family, like people that maybe you got some people in your zone 4 that you really want to connect to because of this and that, or maybe, you know, you can also think of it in that way as well. And then
Yeah.
in the next slide, did you want to add anything else to that, Amy?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that if anybody in the group thinks that they may go on to do market gardening, and you know, often as market gardeners, people feel a little bit rushed during certain times, right? Especially when you're doing your harvest or you're packaging things up or whatever. There's this really tedious auditing process, but it may be well worth it. And it's almost like you can count, you could even put a pedometer on and like count your steps, or you could start counting steps between, like my property is arranged really poorly right now, so that my greenhouse is on one corner and then like the shed where the tools are is on another. So whenever I need a rake, I have to walk like half the length of the property to get it. And I don't want to do that anymore. So I need to move, make a potting shed closer to the greenhouse, right? And you might be like, well, you know, it's not that big of a deal. It's probably not worth changing. But then if you think about that extra, like, let's say it only takes 4 minutes extra a day, but think about that over like the 30 or 40 years that you might garden. Like, it is a bit of a waste of time to do things inefficiently. So just like going through that day-to-day list of tasks could be really helpful. And I don't have any specific tools to use, but if anybody ever wanted to like try that, feel free to email me and we can talk a little bit more through developing a process. A little bit more about how zones might effectively look. They're obviously not always going to be concentric circles.
Yeah. It's kind of like, it's all site specific really. And yeah, it can be different for everybody.
So there's, go
yeah.
ahead. Adam.
No, I was done.
There are sectors, which we're not getting into today, but you're sort of dividing up by compass points, and then to think about flood, high wind, fire, drought, water movement. How do animals move across the property? Are there invasive species that might be like creep crawling along further and further out into the wild or onto your property? So that's a good part of the design process. And
yeah, and that kind of speaks to the observation and interaction aspect of the principle, and just that, like, you really want to. And one of the things that you do in a PDC, a permaculture design certificate course, is you're kind of tasked with designing your own dream property, or in our case, we actually got to design a site that was close to where we're taking the class, and it was going to be implemented in real life. So we came up with all these ideas, and like sort of took some elements from the best ideas and then incorporated into this site there. And so it's helpful to have like a practice go in terms of designing something if you want to delve into this, and or even use your own place as a way of thinking about, okay, where is the prevailing wind coming from, and do I have, you know, noisy neighbors? That's an element that you might want to include into your sectoral map. and then you can kind of design around that. And that's stuff that Toby Hemingway gets into a lot in his book, the Gaia's Garden. And I highly recommend that book if you're interested in function stacking and design elements and how to design. He gets really in depth into that in his book. I'd highly recommend that one.
I could just give you one solid example to illustrate. So if there is, okay, if I'll just ask you a question. If you know, just shout it out, or just want to guess or whatever. But if you had a pasture on a hillside and there was a forest fire, do you think the fire would move with the wind, would move downhill, uphill, or maybe to one side or the other? Most of the time, thinking about like predominant winds. And I don't know that much about animal farming, so this was a bit of a surprise to me, but a lot of people will have lowland pasture areas because that's where brooks and stuff tends to be at the bottom of the watershed. But what happens when you have a fire that starts down there is that it almost always rolls uphill, which you know may not be expected. And so if you have the animals fenced in along the bottom, they don't have anywhere to go. So what people would do in an area that's fire prone is they would have perhaps a bottom pasture, a fairly wide opening into a secondary pasture, and then at the top of the hill they would have a great big release gate. So you don't want the animals to panic and run into a point that's too small. You want to give them enough room. And then when they're in that upper pasture, if it looks dangerous and like the fire is still running, at least you can pull those big gates and just let them run to shelter themselves, right? So like not something most of us would think about, but like pretty critical if you had like 50 cows in that area and you're trying to save them and not have them run straight through the fences and get hurt, right? So some of the other keywords are appropriate technology, which is the appropriate technology is the one that's the simplest. It's the one that makes sense culturally.
It's the one that makes sense to you.
Yeah. And you're using materials that are available. Like there was one point where they were sending solar ovens to places like Nepal, and they had this like super reflective coating on the inside to push, you know, the heat wave, the sun around the pot. And like nobody was using them 6 months later when they went back. And they realized that I think you probably have seen these clothing pieces that are made in Nepal and India, and they're often like little mirrors, little round or triangular or square mirrors that have embroidery around the outside. And they just liked cooking with wood. And so they took all the little the solar cookers and cut them up and used them as embellishments on their clothing. Because nobody asked them what they wanted. They just gave them a technology and told them it was better than what they were using, right? And
I love that story. That's amazing.
It happens all the time.
So classic.
I lived in Ghana for a bit, and I remember somebody donating computers to a village that didn't have any electricity. Anyway, so closing the loops on systems, trying to first reduce waste in your design process, and secondly, use whatever waste is there in an effective and useful way, stacking functions. And then you see this 80-20 thing. Sometimes it's called the Pareto principle, but it's a little bit different here. It's like 80% of the time thinking and designing, and only 20% actual labor. Because if you flip that around and you just start working, you'll find a lot. I mean, you're always going to make mistakes, and that's totally okay. That's how people learn. But anytime I've just really like hacked at something and not thought through it, I've almost always ended up having to redo it. I started garden beds, and I had them all running sort of downhill, and it just wasn't working well. So I had to pull them out and put raised beds in. I put my garden, the only place that I had to put it was like a critical error because the hill is really steep behind it and there's a road. So all of the cold air flows down this steep hill and right over the top of my garden. So I can literally see the frost line, like doesn't touch one side of it, but touches the other side. There's like a line right through the garden bed. So, and I don't have very much choice in where I can put it in my property. So I had to do that. But that one switch probably would have gave me like a week extra growing time on either end of the year. And water management. Adam, you've done a fair amount of swales and different things. Is there anything you want to say about this?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to dwell on this too much because I'm sure this is stuff that as students at Hayes Farm, you probably already have touched on quite a bit, maybe. But I know that your farm does have a number of swales on it. I know Shering and Jared last year, that was like a huge part of their project, or that was a huge project for them to put one up. I think it's field, I don't remember the name of the field 3, maybe, Claire, I don't know if you're still there.
Yeah,
But
3.
yeah, field 3 in the back. So what that is ultimately doing, and especially if you, I mean, when you do a swale on contour, and that is to say like on level ground, if you can find level ground on a hill, then you dig in a trench along that contour. And the idea there is that it will catch water as it rolls down the slope and yeah, kind of saturate the soil that you could then plant into. And it makes for a more conducive area to plant into, and also just locking in water rather than having it just kind of seep and flow right off of your property or whatever. So swales have been starting to, like, they're starting to be quite commonplace in more arid regions in the world where, you know, water is scarce. Although, I mean, still in lots of the states and stuff, they'll simply just irrigate it, and they, of course, they have they're taking their water from rivers and stuff, and riverbeds tend to dry up a lot. So the benefit of swales again is that you're catching all of that rainwater, which is like free water coming down. And like Amy said earlier, water management is like a key pillar of permaculture. And one of the things that the 3 things that you think about in design are: where am I getting my water from? Where am I getting access to my space from? And where are the structures, like the house or the area where I'm going to keep all of my equipment to start implementing, say, this farm, for example. So water, access, structures are the three things that you want to think about when you're, say, designing that dream property of yours. You can't necessarily start your market garden if you don't have water. And that was, I'll tell you that when I was working at the Ville, which is an old school up in Marysville there, we weren't really allowed to use the municipal water because the landlord didn't like us using it. So we had to sort of innovate, and we started collecting water from any kind of roof surface that we could. And you know, we had to sort of figure out ways to water our crops without using the municipal water. So yeah, water is crucial, and it's crucial to life in general. So that's why it's a key aspect. But I'll just leave it at that, I guess.
I don't know if Mark shared it with the 2 of you, Amy and Adam, but we started calling, well, I think what's in field 3, so what String was working on last year, are proper swales. They're more or less on contour. But the kind of zigzag that was built first, that goes through the middle of one of our big fields, we've started calling it berm and switch, because it's kind of a swale because it zigzags, but it's also kind of a ditch. So it's been renamed affectionately.
And if you guys want to see a really big swale, go up to Knowlesville. Alex Murray has a giant, probably like 6 to 10 foot deep swale, and it's awesome. It's just cool to see because he's got all of these plants growing up the kind of slope of the swale, and it's fairly established. So it's kind of neat. But there's other methods too. There's key line, which is where you're basically dragging a piece of metal through the soil. And what that does is when every time it rains, the water, rather than just flowing off the slope, percolates into the ground. So again, what it says here on the slide is slow it, spread it, sink it, and store it. So again, water is a form of energy. So we got to store energy.
Well, okay, there's a couple of things I'd say. One of them is that keeping soil covered goes along with water management. That's the one sure way to prevent erosion. Water and bare soil do not ever mix. And the other thing I would say is it's just a broad caution when it comes to permaculture. A lot of resources are coming from drier areas, specifically the ones that are like developed by Jeff Lawton, and they're very like Australian based. Australia is going through intensive drought periods over and over again. New Brunswick, however, is like having small drought periods, but also as climate change happens and we have shifts, we're going to keep getting more and more water coming off of like ocean patterns. And so you please do think about your land and not just apply some broad technique or principle. If you have to actually dig test pits, see what the soil looks like, see how far down the water table is, like do a good amount of research before you make big infrastructure changes around water.
Yeah, and further to that, crap, I lost it. It's gone. I had a good point there to make, but anyway, it's gone.
There's this super cool set of YouTube videos. So it's called the Pawnee Foundation, and it was so bad in India and certain villages where people were having to weave seasonally during the dry season. There were some others where they had to bring in tanker trucks full of water just to keep people alive in there. And so they got like this movie star to like head this whole thing up and be a spokesperson. And they got hundreds of small villages in this competition to see who can conserve, not necessarily conserve water, but build up infrastructure. So they're creating like ponds and dams and swales, and it's absolutely the best thing. I didn't want to embed videos in because sometimes that just throws everybody off of Zoom, but like, yeah, Pawnee Water Cup, it'll for sure make your day if you want to watch one of those.
I was gonna just add to I remember what I was gonna say. Because in New Brunswick, as we're more and more affected by climate change and stuff, we're gonna start to see periods of where we'll get heavy rain, and then longer periods of drought. So that collection, like it might not seem pertinent at this point to collect water. Oh, I'm on a well, whatever, or I'm on a municipal, but collecting rainwater is never a bad idea, especially for those periods in the summer.
Yeah, so soil building, of course, a critical part of permaculture, and something that is like very new, really. Prior to having these scanning electron microscopes and microscopes that would go over like it takes about 400 times magnification to be able to see most bacteria. So we just simply didn't have them for most of like our scientific, Renaissance periods. And so we're learning so much more now. Like soil biology also doesn't take precedence because people have this mental disconnect between people and soil and food. So we tend to like put our energy into medicine, but it's absolutely critical to think about what's going on in life with the soil.
And I feel like soil building is critical. Sorry, someone's just saying that it's also critical in terms of like its role in in fighting climate change as well. I mean, if and I feel like regenerative agriculture is more on the menu, especially on larger scale farming. And like, you know, if you have good healthy soil, then you can have good healthy plants, and if you have good healthy plants, then you're going to be absorbing more CO2 from the atmosphere. So if we can integrate more regenerative agriculture practices in mainstream conventional farming, that would be a huge carbon sink for CO2. So soil plays a huge role in fighting climate change, and that's kind of doubled down on in the documentary Kiss the Ground, which you know, is like a star-studded documentary, but there's a lot of good messages to come out of that.
There's only, by my clock, about 10 minutes left, and I would like to have an opportunity for people to chat. So I think I might skip through this bit. This is trophic levels in the soil food web, and this is a graphic from, again, from Dr. Elaine Ingham that you can find anywhere online.
Don't use glyphosate. Kills all those things.
And there's lots of opportunities for ecosystem restoration in New Brunswick, because we do have a fairly diverse set of environments here. Climate is a really important consideration, and you can think a little bit more about something called, it's the P.A. Yeoman's scale of permanence. I know Claire has this resource, but climate is the one that you almost can never change. It's very, very difficult. You can make little microclimates by adding ponds and putting big rocks in and making shelters, but it's a real critical consideration early on. And yeah, so there's resources. There's like some global ones. There's some stuff that's very permaculture specific, Canada-wide and in New Brunswick. And then there's some groups here that have like a more general mandate. But now that you have a bit of a better idea of what permaculture is, like, do you see how you can apply this in your own life? Or maybe are there like areas that you're really, really interested in? Like I want to learn a lot more about Acadian forests and how to do that kind of restoration.
I'm definitely like interested in, like, we're considering trying to find some land. So kind of that whole like start at the beginning. But right now my partner and I are just renting in downtown. So we're trying to implement some of these solutions, but it's kind of like that interplay of how much can you get the landlord to let you do without getting people upset about your lawn being long. But I do feel like, yeah.
I was gonna say that a lot of landlords actually love it when you rip up their lawn and put in a garden. Or not a lot, but some. You might get luck out.
We've been doing pretty good, but we did get a drop by yesterday, and they're like, okay, you need to like cut the ferns down and like checking in, like, you know, you need to like cut the grass here. So like they're actually pretty chill, and it was kind of like educational. They're like, what is this? We're like, that's a black currant. It gives you food. And I agree, like most landlords are pretty good with like, you know, you're improving their property. And we've got pretty awesome neighbors. So I really like Amy's like emphasis on social permaculture, because I do feel like so much of this requires buy-in from like your neighbors or the people you like know. And so I feel like building a, you know, like we don't have a setup for rainwater catchment, but our neighbor lets us use hers. So kind of like building those connections can be helpful for folks who might not have like a lot of space. So yeah, I'm interested in all of it.
And I know there's some books out there that are like permaculture for people who live in apartment buildings. Like there are different, like you don't have to have a whole swath of land to be able to do permaculture. You can do it in your own mind.
I think Hemingway did a book on like urban permaculture recently, and it's like an emphasis on like like urban spaces, and then I think more of that like social lens too. I haven't got to read it yet, but I read the Gaia's one. I really liked it.
There's a woman that I like named Jessie Blomquist. So she did an urban permaculture one, and she's also very much into like landscape design to make spaces that are very like spiritually and emotionally fulfilling. And that's a kind of, I've actually only really heard Alex Murray talk much about the aesthetic part of permaculture. And it's like, yeah, okay, produce food, serve all these functions, you know, treat groundwater, whatever. But like, there's that other part of the design that's like, for me, I'm like, well, I just want like every color of lilac blooming at once. Like, and it's great if like butterflies want to come there, but like, I want that. I just want this place where I want to sit for like 2 weeks of the year and do nothing except read under these lilacs. And like, who, you know, stacking functions is great, but who cares? Because we have to take care of ourselves too, right? So like design for smells and colors and textures and like that path, like how can it feel nice if you want to walk on it in bare feet? Can you put big flat stones and put like mint or creeping thyme around it? Like make permaculture your own, I guess.
I would say one challenge too, and I don't mean this the way it's going to come out, but it's like a lot of people like judge you if you start doing this kind of stuff. Like they look at you like you're like crazy or like super like hippy dippy. And like I find there's a lot of judgment from more like conventional or like, you know, capitalist or consumer ways, which I still very much participate in, but I'm trying to, you know, kind of shift. And so it's nice to have communities like this because then you don't feel so alone. And it's like, no, that's not a completely ridiculous idea. It's just different. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's totally just a way of thinking. It's, you know, but my sister still thinks it's a cult because it has the word cult in it. But
yeah, I was just thinking like haters be hating. There's just, you know, they're the people that mow their lawn on the double diagonal, like mow it twice just so that they have like diamond shaped patterns in it. And probably trying to get them on your side is like a bit of a waste of time, but
it's just a lack of understanding, and I think that people that judge others that practice permaculture just don't understand what permaculture is.
well, we've just got like 5 minutes left. It was really nice to be with you today. And it's nice to do this as a yearly activity. And I don't need as many students as I did in the beginning when the farm first started. And so I like to have these opportunities. Probably Adam's already been on the farm, and I'll come by sometime before the next couple of months and hopefully meet some of you folks in person.
Well, it looks like Doreen's got a question.
Yeah, go on, Doreen.
You can't hear me again. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, this is for Amy. When we go on the field trip on that Sunday, are we taking a bus or do we take our own vehicles?
It's all of our own vehicles.
And another student was asking, is there still room?
I think we could take one. How many more? Was it just one person? Or
It was just one person that asked if there was any room left on the field trip.
Sure, they can just send me an email.
Okay, thank you. Are we taking a bus?
No, our own vehicles.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right.
Claire, are you still, can you hear me?
Yep. Hi.
Is there a way you want, like this presentation has been shared with Mark, and I think he has the ability to edit. If he doesn't, I can give him the ability to do that, so you can share it with other people. I guess if people want to keep it for a long time, it might be best to download it, because I don't know how long I could potentially lose things on my Google Drive. But I don't mind people keeping copies of this. It's not like proprietary information.
Sure. You're talking about the slideshow?
Yep.
Yeah,
Just
absolutely.
there's a lot of references for future reading and stuff like that in there.
Sure, we can definitely make sure it's available.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah.
I hope that you guys have a wonderful growing season, and I'll look forward to hopefully meeting some of you in person someday this summer.
Yeah, thanks both to you both so very much. And definitely we hope to see you on the farm. That would be great. We do have another open farm day this Saturday. I don't imagine most of our crew will be here. I know a few will be, but yeah, we hope to see you soon.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. That was
Take
awesome.
care, everyone. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.